the referenda that were held in Kherson, Zaporizhia, those are two oblasts or provinces that have been occupied by Russia. They were, prior to this referenda, sovereign Ukrainian territory. And also the referenda were held in the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic, which used to be sovereign Ukrainian territory, but in February of this year, the populations there held referenda to declare their independence, and this independent status was recognized by Russia, and that's what led to Russia's carrying out the special military operation, which was ostensibly in support of these two newly independent republics. They've now all voted to become part of Russia, and the Russian government has agreed to this. The referenda are controversial. While Russia cites the United Nations Charter and the notion of the right of people to choose their own way, to self-determination, I think it's widely recognized around the world that to hold referenda in a time of war, especially where the war is divisive in nature, Ukrainian populations that may have voted against this referenda have fled. So one can't speak of the totality of the population participating. So there's some controversy there. On the other hand, Russia's made it clear that it's not playing games. It conducted this referenda with the objective of transforming these formerly Ukrainian territories into Mother Russia, and that changes the entire character of this conflict. It's no longer a conflict between Ukraine and Russia being fought on Ukrainian soil. Starting today, because Vladimir Putin has signed off, it's official. These territories are Russia as far as the Russians are concerned. This is a conflict being fought by Ukrainians on Russian soil. And this, I believe, is going to allow Russia to redefine this conflict, redefine the legal characteristics of this conflict away from a special military operation, which was designed to liberate Donetsk and Lugansk from Ukrainian oppression, Ukrainian threats, to the defense of Mother Russia. Russia has mobilized 300,000 troops in support of this. And I think we're going to see Russia come at Ukraine with a different military approach, one that is broader in scope and scale, one that by the time it's finished may result in 4 additional Ukrainian provinces being absorbed by Russia, that being Odessa, Mykolaiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkiv. You see the destruction of the Ukrainian military, and to see regime change in Kiev with the Zelensky regime being evicted and a pro-Russian regime putting in. These are Russian, I believe, will be the Russian objectives. Claiming to have an objective and accomplishing the mission are two totally different things. So it's yet to be seen whether or not Russia will be able to do what it says it, or what it's positioned itself to do. But be that as may, we're seeing a definite change in the conflict in Ukraine. It's becoming broader in scope and scale. We already saw that it changed from being a Ukrainian-Russian conflict to being a NATO-Russian conflict. The Ukrainian military that's operating today is a de facto proxy of NATO. It's trained, equipped by NATO. It's provided intelligence, communication support, logistic support by NATO. This is why Russian President Putin, when he spoke of the referenda, he spoke of a conflict between Russia and the collective West, not just Ukraine, but the collective West. NATO and nations who aren't members of NATO who are also providing assistance. So this is a fundamental confrontation between Russia and the West, which didn't exist when this conflict first started. This has become, for Russia, an existential conflict. That's an important term, because that means that Russia is fighting for the very survival of the Russian state. Defeat is not an option. Russia cannot lose this conflict. The question now is, is the collective West viewing their support of Ukraine to be existential in nature? Are they going to put everything at stake? And when I mean everything, I mean the survival of their respective nations. Russia is willing to use nuclear weapons to defend the Russian state. Is NATO willing to use nuclear weapons to defend Ukraine? I think the answer is no. But NATO has been caught by the Russian actions. I believe NATO has been put into what is known as a horns of a dilemma, meaning no matter what they do, they're going to get impaled on a horn. There is no good option. They've overcommitted to their support for Ukraine. They continue to say that they're going to provide support to Ukraine to recapture the former Ukrainian territories. But that means that now Ukraine will be invading Russia from the Russian perspective, which Russia will, of course, up the stakes. I don't think NATO is willing to double down on this, which means NATO is going to suffer another embarrassing defeat if Russia defeats Ukraine, a defeat along the lines of Afghanistan, but even worse, because this is in their backyard. They've committed everything. But I think it's a defeat that NATO will have to absorb, because the consequences of going to war with Russia are just too great. It's a very dangerous situation. I don't know if the world's woken up to just how dangerous the current situation is. It's extraordinarily dangerous.
The mainstream media classifies this as a war of aggression initiated by Russia. That's not a true statement, right?
Well, I mean, if you start on February 24th, and that's your starting point, yes, Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine. And people would say, well, that's a war of aggression. But this is not about starting on February 24th. This is about starting back in February of 2014 with the coup d'etat, the US-backed coup d'etat in Kiev, where a president, Viktor Yanukovych, who many people call Putin's puppet, but he wasn't. He was elected by the Ukrainian people. And you can't be Putin's puppet if you were in the process of considering the pivoting of Ukraine towards the European Union, which is what led to the Maidan demonstrations to begin with in 2013. Yanukovych was presented with a decision. Do you pivot away from Russia and go to the European Union, or do you continue with your economic alignment with Russia? He wanted to pivot to Europe, but he was unable to do so. The practicalities of it were such. I mean, Putin told him, if you want to go to the European Union, feel free. We're not going to stop you, but we're not going to pay for it. Because there's significant economic reforms that have to take place. Russia he was being asked Russia to provide loans. Russia's not going to give you loans so you can pivot away from it. So Putin said, do what you want, pivot all you want. We're not going to stop you. You're a sovereign nation, but we're not going to underwrite it. We're not going to pay for it. And Yanukovych was unable to do this. And so there was a popular uprising that began in 2013, carried over into 2014, very peaceful in nature. People just simply expressing their anger that Yanukovych was unable to fulfill what they viewed as his promise to pivot to the EU. This peaceful demonstration was hijacked by the right ultra-nationalist forces in Ukraine, supported by the United States. These are the right sector, Sloboda, the supporters of Stepan Bandera, that Nazi affiliated thug who murdered hundreds of thousands of people back in the Second World War and afterwards. These people hijacked this peaceful demonstration, turned it into a violent uprising that evicted Viktor Yanukovych from Kiev. They seized power. They took on an anti-Russian agenda, passing legislation which banned the Russian language, banned Russian culture. Then they began attacking the Russians, whom they called orcs, by the way, dehumanizing them. They burned 84 of them to death in Odessa, and then they proceeded to lay waste to Mariupol, the city on the Sea of Azov, what had been known as the Kharkov's men's soccer club, which was a group of pro-Bandera thugs, transformed themselves into the Azov Regiment, and they began a campaign of genocide against the Russians compelling the Russian population in the Donbass regions to rise up and resist. Russia supported them in terms of protecting their rights, but Russia told them straight up, you can't declare yourself independent of Ukraine. The Donbass is Ukraine. I mean, everybody says that Russia was seeking to take the Donbass. This is absurd. Russia, from the very beginning in 2014, let it be known that while they will defend the autonomy of these Russians, they're not going to defend independence. That this will be, part of Ukraine. That's why Russia promoted the Minsk Accords, Minsk II Accords. The first one in 2014 collapsed, but the second one in 2015 was negotiated with what's called the Normandy format, Germany and France, working with Ukraine, with Russia as an observer, to pass legislation. First of all, there was a ceasefire to pass legislation that would respect the autonomy, the rights of the Russians to have their own language, culture, etc., but they would be part of Ukraine. The Ukrainian government never ratified this. Why? And we now know. President Poroshenko, who was president at the time, said this was a sham. We only did Minsk II to buy time so that NATO could build up our army so that we could forcefully recapture the Donbass. So Ukraine never had any intention of a peaceful resolution. Ukraine always sought a violent resolution. And indeed, for 8 years, Ukraine carried out vicious shelling of the Donbass areas. Again, the same President Poroshenko infamously gave a speech where he said, our children, meaning Ukrainian children, will go to school and live healthy lives. Your children will be cowering in the basements while we shell them. I mean, so that was going on. Russia continuously pressured Ukraine, Germany, and France, and the United States to have Minsk implemented, to bring an end to this conflict. Indeed, in June of 2021, Russian President Putin met with American President Biden in Geneva. And one of the main points that Putin pushed was, look, if you don't want a military conflict in Ukraine, all you have to do is get the Ukrainian government to ratify the Minsk agreement. If you do that, this whole thing's over. It's over. And Biden promised him that he would do that. Indeed, Blinken later on afterwards said, yes, we will push the Ukrainians to do this. But they were lying, because it was never the policy of the United States to implement Minsk. It was the policy of the United States to use Minsk as a cover to buy time to train Ukrainian forces. We had a permanent military training presence in Ukraine where every 55 days we trained a battalion of Ukrainian soldiers to NATO standards, which were then sent east to kill Russians. And we bragged about it. We have a slide put out by the public affairs officer of this training unit bragging about how we're training these guys to go fight Russians in the east. That was what we did. And we did this from 2015 to 2022, 7 years. Every 55 days, a battalion. You count up how many battalions there were. It's a significant number. We built up this army, 60,000, that were poised to attack the Donbass in late February, early March of 2022. This is why Putin launched a special military operation. It was a preemptive attack to make sure that those Ukrainians couldn't attack the Donbass. So to say this is a war of aggression is an absolute misread of history. Would Russia have preferred a peaceful outcome? Yes, they tried for 7 years. They tried to get Minsk to. They begged the United States to implement. They begged the Germans and the French to implement it, but it was a sham. As the President Poroshenko said, it was a sham. There was no intention on the part of the West to implement Minsk. Russia had no choice but to do what it did.
So Zelensky is saying that they want to expedite their country going into NATO. Is that going to make the situation worse?
Well, let's put it this way. Let's just hypothetically say that all 30 nations of NATO said, that's a great idea. We want to do that. On day one of Ukraine becoming a member, NATO would be at war with Russia on day one. And this is a war that would be existential in nature, a war that would almost immediately result in Russia using nuclear weapons against NATO. So NATO would cease to exist. So what Zelensky's asking NATO to do is to swallow a giant cyanide tablet. He's saying, here, I want you to commit suicide. I want you to invite me in while I'm engaged in a life and death struggle with Russia, so that the moment I join your organization, you're engaged in a life and death struggle with Russia, and Russia is going to immediately obliterate the totality of your cities. It will never happen. This is why not only did the United States come out and say, that's not going to happen. NATO came out and said, no, 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 we're not going to let 10 NATO nations, of course. Yeah, these are the most virulently Russophobic nations: Poland, the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, Romania, and others. But the rest of NATO, the core of NATO, Italy, France, Germany, they all said, nope, that ain't going to happen. So this is just wishful thinking on the part of Zelensky, but it's a clever move. I mean, you have to give Zelensky credit for being able to manipulate NATO. He knew the answer was going to be no. But what happens when people say no? They feel guilty. And so the guilt-ridden NATO is now going to continue to provide a fire hose spigot blasting equipment and money into Ukraine to sustain this conflict. NATO has made it clear, the United States has made it clear that they will continue to provide assistance to Ukraine. But the goal of this, and this is where Zelensky is a horrible leader of his people, because he believes that the goal, or he interprets the goal of NATO to support Ukrainian sovereignty and a Ukrainian victory. I don't think there's anybody in the West that believes Ukraine's going to win this conflict, because NATO isn't willing at the end of the day to go all in. Russia's going all in. They're putting all their chips on the table. NATO's not willing to do that, which means Zelensky is going to be left holding a pair of threes while Russia's holding a full house. So he's going to lose every time. But NATO's willing to provide Ukraine equipment and money so that Ukraine can kill as many Russians as possible. But this means that ultimately that this will end up in the destruction of the Ukrainian state, literally the destruction of the Ukrainian state.
The mainstream media is saying that Russia is failing in this endeavor. What's your take?
Well, they're not wrong. The fact of the matter is, Russia overextended itself. The special military operation was given sources adequate to the task, the original task of liberating Donbass, but it wasn't resourced to the level necessary to fight the collective West. I think you and I have had this conversation in the past, where I spoke of the decision in May by the United States and NATO to provide tens of billions of dollars worth of military equipment to the Ukrainian military and to provide strategic depth so that Ukraine could train its forces outside of the reach of Russian attack, to provide intelligence support, communication support, logistics support, to transform the Ukrainian military into a NATO force. This was a game-changing event. And I said right off the bat that Russia doesn't have the resources capable of resolving this, that Russia will have to generate more troops. Russia, over the course of the summer, of course, didn't. Russia continued its tactics of grinding away in the Donetsk region, very successfully, by the way. They were killing tens of thousands of Ukrainians, slowly taking territory. But the end result is that Ukraine was able to build up this massive force of 40, 60,000 well-trained, well-equipped troops. And then they came into Ukraine. A lot of people, lambasted me when I said game. They said, Russia will never allow these forces to be accumulated. Russia will destroy them before they get across the border. Russia will blow up the warehouses and the roads. And well, Russia didn't. And these 60,000 troops were able to be brought to bear on the battlefield. People mock the Ukrainians. They're not well trained. I've always said the Ukrainians are very well trained, very well motivated, good fighters. And we saw that. They outmaneuvered the Russians. They launched an attack in Kherson that caused Russia to shift strategic reserves out of the Kharkiv region. And then they launched a major attack in the Kharkiv region, picking the precise seam where Russia was at its weakest. In this village which was held by two SWAT teams. How do you expect two SWAT teams to hold off Ukrainian armored divisions? They can't. These SWAT teams fought heroically. They held out. They killed lots of Ukrainians, but in the end, they, like the rest of the Russian military, was compelled to retreat. The Ukrainians humiliated the Russians. They seized all of the Kharkiv area, Russia fell back, claimed to consolidate their defenses, but then the Ukrainians did it again, finding a seam in the Russian defenses in Limon and attacking there, pushing them back, humiliating Putin on the eve of the referendum, claiming all of this is Mother Russia. And Ukraine went, this ain't Mother Russia. We got it back from you. It's a humiliation. Then they're doing it in Kherson. They found the seam in the Russian defenses, pushed through, claimed more territory. Russia's being humiliated. They're not being defeated. They're being humiliated. The Ukrainians are burning through their reserves. This is a Pyrrhic victory. It looks bad for Russia. It is bad for Russia. And here's the thing: victory is a narcotic. You inject victory into the veins of troops, and they will continue to fight like son of a guns. Defeat is addictive. You start learning how to lose. Right now, the Russians are sort of learning how to lose, and the Ukrainians are injecting the narcotic of victory into their veins. Russia needs to do something. They need to stabilize this, and then they need to get these 300,000 mobilized troops in. Now, people say, oh, those 300,000, they're not very good. Hey, guys, read history. A guy named Rick Atkinson wrote a wonderful trilogy about the U.S. Army in World War II. And it's amazing, the U.S. Army didn't perform well early on. Everybody remember the Battle of Kasserine Pass, where the Germans wiped out the Second Corps. General Fredericks was relieved, and they brought in a guy whose name was George Patton. George Patton came in, and he taught them how to win. Well, the Russians just relieved a very inefficient commander of the Western Military District, and they replaced him. They got 300,000 troops coming in. The thing that Atkinson talked about, the transition of the U.S. Army from 1942 to 1945 saw not only the expansion of it, but it became the most professional army of amateurs the world has ever seen. Because the army that we built in World War II was not an army of professional soldiers. It was an army of men, farmers, workers, men who had lives that wanted to get back. All they wanted to do is get back to life. They did not want to go to war. They didn't volunteer to go to war. They were conscripted to go to war. But what happened when they were conscripted? They got to their wives and they said, honey, I got to go. And the wives cried, and their wives released them. These guys went off to fight. And they won because they knew the quickest way home was to win the war and come home. These 300,000 that the Russians just mobilized, that's that kind of people. These aren't the 250,000 cowards that ran away from the fight, fled the country. These are 300,000 workers, men with jobs, men with families, men with that are part of the Russian soil, not professional soldiers. They used to serve in the military. They did their duty, and they came home to live their lives. And now they're being called back. And what are these guys doing? They're not chanting USA, USA, USA. They're not wrapping themselves in the flag. They're just looking like, okay, let's get this thing done. We're going to go to work. We're going to get the job done. We're coming home. God help the Ukrainians when these 300,000 troops are let loose on them. They're not fanatics. These are guys who are going to get the job done. They know what the job is. They know what they're signing up for. And they're going to do it. And that's going to be a game changer. The Ukrainians are fighting for their national survival, and it's going to be a tough fight. Don't get me wrong, but NATO's out of equipment. The German parliament just voted overwhelmingly not to provide heavy equipment to NATO. The United States passed a $12 billion arms allocation, but it's not weaponry that's going to give to them now. We don't have anything left to give them. So we're going to have to build it. It's not going to be ready to be given to the Ukrainians until the end of 2023, early 2024. This is the reality. The Russians up by the hand, everybody's like, these reserves, they're going to have old equipment. And yet they're looking at the trains coming in going, that's brand new stuff. Yeah, Russia since 2016 has been building a lot of equipment for the reserve forces. And these reserves are going to fall in on brand new equipment. They're going to be motivated to get the job done. And I think we're going to see both a qualitative and quantitative alteration of the battlefield in the months to come. But let's deal with the here and now. It's embarrassing for Russia. The 150th Motorized Rifle Division, a storied unit, recently remobilized. It's a unit that captured Berlin. They were mobilized and reconstituted in 2017. These guys, it's an expanded division with 4 regiments. These guys are good, modern equipment, everything. They lost their battle flag. No unit loses its battle flag. No unit loses its battle flag. Only a unit that is totally given up. You burn your battle flag. That's what happened to the 4th Marine Regiment in Corregidor when they were told to surrender. First thing they did is they fought to the death. There was hardly anybody left alive. And the last orders given by the Marine regimental commander was burn the colors. Our colors will never fall into the hands of the enemy. That's what a unit with pride does. The 150th gave up.
So we're just about out of time. So why don't you plug your book?
A book. Well, we just talked about doom and despair. My book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union, I think is a book about a time when we had similar levels of despair in the 1980s, where nuclear war was looming. And yet the United States and the Soviet Union found a way to come together to get rid of the nuclear weapons that threatened. And that was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This book is a history of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, told through the experiences of me. I was one of the first inspectors on the ground. I played an important role in implementing a critical aspect of this treaty. So it's an interesting story from that standpoint, a very human story, not only about the inspectors, but about the Russians. This is a book that will teach everybody who reads it about the Russian people, the Russian psyche, about perestroika, what happened, why it failed, from the Russian perspective. It's also a book that provides a template of hope. When people take a look today and say, how in God's name are the United States and the Russians ever going to come together and find a way out of where we are? This book shows you that there was a time when we did just that. This Camelot-like moment where everything came together. We worked together to get rid of nuclear weapons. We worked together for mutual benefit. And we can do it again. So if you read this book, not only will you learn a lot about the history of arms control, but you'll also learn, as George Santayana once said, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. But the implication there is that history failed. Let's call it those who fail to learn about the successes of history are condemned never to repeat it. You read this book, you'll learn about one of the greatest successes in American history.
So people that are listening and watching to this, where can they get it?
Well, right now you can get the book on Clarity Press's website. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Barnes and Nobles. But the best way to get it is to go to your local bookstore and ask the bookseller not only to stock the book, but here's a hint. Why don't you have a book signing event where yours truly will come in, talk about the book, you can buy the book there, and it would be a wonderful deal. So there's lots of options there.
If somebody's listening to this in California, you'd fly out to California to sign books?
If California was able to come up with 3 book events, then I could do it. One book event, wow, it would be a money-losing proposition for me. But if you could get 3 book events, I'm convinced I could get anybody who attended wanting to buy the book, and they would buy the book, and then it was something to be worthwhile for me. Yeah.
Great.